All right, so we're back again. I'm Katy McKinney, the founder and head of school for Lafayette Academy. This is the Lady K podcast, and today we have the great privilege of having Mr. Keith Preston with us. He has been with our school for 7 years, teaching U.S. history to our middle schoolers. So we have had the great privilege of having Mr. Preston with us for a number of years. First started off as one of our board members, and then there was a need for a history teacher, and gratefully he said I would be happy to help, and he had already since retired, but we were able to have the great blessing of having him teach our middle schoolers, and it just continued to grow from there. So welcome.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with just the question, why get into teaching? Because you've had quite a diverse career, but what attracted you to teach?
Right. My first career was in investing, but my BA was in history. And I guess you could say I was marinated in it from an early age because I had a father who was a history major at Preston. And so my memories of growing up in my family were discussions around the table about things involving history, current events, what was going on in the news. And I remember at the time when I started up my career in investing, one of the things that was in the back of my mind is if I get successful in investing, then maybe I could retire early and then I'd do whatever it is I want to do because I love it. And that would be maybe teaching history someday. The first part did not turn out. My investing career was okay. But I did get the opportunity later in life when it seemed a good time for a career change to go back and get my master's and wait for an opportunity, well, not wait, but look for an opportunity to teach history. And that happened in 2002. So with that background and with that love I've always had for history and the major that I'd had in history myself in college, it seemed a natural fit. And the only question is once you get in the classroom, does that work?
And obviously it has.
Well, I was very fortunate. At the school where I was, which was a private school, there were some outstanding master teachers. And so I had friends who would come in and give me ideas or give me an approach. And the best advice I ever got was from one of those master teachers, the person you and I talked about earlier, who said to me, if you are enthusiastic about your subjects, then your students will be too. And I found that's probably the best advice I've gotten for teaching.
That's wonderful. Actually, that is exactly one of the reasons why I started this school, because prior to starting the school, when I homeschooled my kids, all was well when they're 2, 5, and 7. But I knew in short order that they would get to be 13, 14, 15 years old. And they're, in terms of all the wonderful subjects that we have to teach them, I wasn't the best at everything. And I thought, man, if I could just find someone who's excellent in their craft, in history, in science, in math, whatever it was, then that would really ignite the fire within each of those subjects for the kids. And you were exactly what we needed at that time when we first got going. So you've had the opportunity to teach at private schools, public schools? No public schools. No. And obviously at our classical school.
Right.
Have you seen differences? Is there something that's different about classical education when it comes to teaching history versus currently what's going on in America? And can you contrast those two?
Sure. One of the things that I did get when I was taking my master's was you are required and expected to go in and visit others' classrooms and observe. And what I've observed happening not only in the classroom, but in the advancement of how to teach history today is a big change, which I think has not been positive. And that is, rather than set things up as a narrative so that the students can understand how things fit together and the idea of cause and effect, they are given units on specific things, a unit on slavery, a unit on women's rights, a unit on what's going on with the Great Depression or something like that, which I'm not saying that's a bad thing to have those subjects, but if you have them as disconnected pieces, as opposed to building a narrative and showing the changes and showing the evolution of thought, then the kids it's all it is what do I have to pass the test? And it doesn't have any lasting part on it. So what you get out of a classical education, what you get out of a good private school education, but particularly a classical education, is that human beings have not evolved as much as we would like to think over the past several thousand years. And some of the same problems that the ancient Egyptians had or that Europe had in the the 19th century or what was going on in America in 2025 are much of the same problems. And then one of the ways to try to avoid repeating those mistakes is understanding the way humans interact, the way they think, and the way they make decisions, and then going forward, how leadership addresses those. And if students come in with no knowledge of that at all, then they're going to repeat the same mistakes, as we're seeing right now. And people are saying, well, let's try socialism. I have a little cartoon that I love to put out, and it's got a guy with a fork standing right in front of us, big wall socket, and the friends next to him says, don't you realize that, and the socket says socialism, this doesn't work. Oh, the guy with the fork says, this time we're going to do it differently. And so what a classical education does is it gives you that background. It fills in those areas. It helps you see the turning points and helps you see the movements that worked and the ones that failed and why. In America, we've always been taught, when you and I were growing up, that this is the American experiment, and it still is. Mm-hmm. But there's a reason why in just 250 years we're so successful. A classical school, a classical education would give you that background, and the framers knew with the classical education they had, what were the mistakes that have been made in the past? What were the mistakes in Greece and Rome and other failed governmental systems? And they saw with the Enlightenment guys that they would study as part of a classical education. This is the way we ought to go. Let's try it. It's never been tried. We haven't, we're not going to have a dictator. We're not going to have a king. We're going to have self-government. And everyone said, well, that'll fail. And here we are 250 years later, and we're still number one, and nobody even close in number two. So a classical education gives these students that so that they can then take that forward and where they're going to go with their lives.
It sounds to me that there's sort of a holistic approach then to classical ed. And I know you have actually woven, obviously, not only the amazing stories you share with our students, but also books. You've done Nectar in the Sieve, which was an interesting, and I think the kids just loved that phenomenal book. What else have you all read?
Well, we've had a lot. Sometimes we'll have pieces. In the past, we've done things. We had a book called The Summer of 1789, all about the Constitutional Convention. And then sometimes we'll take bits and pieces. I like to take a lot of different parts of videos if they're appropriate, and I write up. We don't just put in a video and show it. I have usually a little guidance sheet for them to look at questions to answer as we're going through it. So it's a multimedia type thing. But the background of all these things is to give them a broader knowledge. And when we do that, we're able to show them how these things that people went through or things that people experience or choices that they made relate to what their choice is going to be as they're going forward. I also try to tell the kids, one of the reasons I'm here is you're going to be a voter someday, which means you're going to be part of the system of choosing the next government and going on 30, 40, 50 years. And so in order to handle that responsibility, you need to understand the world that you're coming into and the world that formed it so that you can make better choices, and we're counting on you. And so I see them as future voters, too.
So is that one of the reasons you feel history is so important?
Absolutely. Because especially in a country which is based on self-government, then you need to make sure that the founders talked about that. I think it was John Adams that wrote one time, some of the keys is you have to have education because those people who are going to be educated are going to be the ones who are going to choose who's going to govern. And they're going to make mistakes because they're human, and the representatives are going to make mistakes. But you try to give them some basis for that. So when we started off in the beginning of the year, for instance, talking about the American system, one of the key things you see, Harvard is only about 10 or 15 years, founded 10 or 15 years after Mayflower comes here. Very early on, we started putting in our own educational system because we saw how important that was if you're going to be self-government to have an educated citizenship.
So you've mentioned the different books, different resources. Classically, too, we really pride ourselves on first source documents. And I just was remembering you had a phenomenal experience this last year. I think you were studying the Civil War, and you brought out a letter. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment?
This is something that first made a big impression on me with the probably most famous documentary ever, certainly on PBS, which was the Ken Burns Civil
Yeah.
War series, which I've used several times in my classes throughout my 20 plus years of teaching. And in that, there's a letter that was found by a man named Sullivan Ballou, who was a Rhode Island officer. And he writes it the night before Bull Run to his wife. And he talks about how he realizes that it may be possible that he will not survive the next day. And if he does, he's willing to give up everything on this earth, as he says, to ensure the stability and the survival of the government. And he feels that he owes a debt to the generation which just 80 years before had set up this self-governing nation in this new world. And then he goes on to talk about how much he loves his wife, and he's sorry he won't be there to raise the kids. And usually by the time we get to the end of that, the girls, particularly who don't think they're interested in the Civil War, are crying, because the man obviously so much loves his family, and yet this is so important. He's willing to risk that all to make sure that that government stands. And of course, 2 years later, Abraham Lincoln saying the same thing at Gettysburg, that we've got to ensure that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people survives. And that's what the war is about making sure that government survives. So putting something like that into the hands of the student, asking them to talk about it, to express their feelings, how they respond to it, was really, I think you got some feedback on that. It was really an important thing for the kids to suddenly not just see these as people that lived 200 years ago, but they could relate to the feelings as humans and how they would feel if they were put in that position, if their parents had been put in that position today. And that means that will be something, hopefully, that they'll remember for a long time.
I remember when that happened, I guess it was this spring sometime, and I remember I wasn't close to the room when it happened, but the middle school girls, a number of them did start crying. And I think it was one of the most powerful reactions you've received on that letter in the last 20 years. So much so that I heard the crying continued into the next class. But one of the girls, one of her responses, which I thought was so beautiful, she said, the love that was expressed from this husband to his wife, she said, I hope that I am loved like that.
Yeah. And again, that's one of those things that helps them pierce a little bit of what they think is a wall between themselves and the past, and realize that we're all looking for the same thing. We're all looking for the best for our children, which is why they go to a school like Lafayette Academy. We're all looking for some way to better our nation, because it's a good nation with good ideals, and that we're striving to maintain those. And then if they're affected by something like this because of the emotional contact that makes with them, then that's something hopefully that they'll remember in years. That I still have kids who remember when I did that in class 15, 20 years ago. So I remember that letter. I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember the way that made me feel. And that made them, for the first time, feel connected to these people as people, and not just things they had to know for the test.
So to me, history is one of those subjects like literacy, like math, that I'm grateful we get to teach every single day from kindergarten through 12th grade. We call it history. We don't call it social studies. Out in the wide world today, there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about America, about U.S. history.
Yeah.
Could you name just maybe two ideals that you feel are misconceptions that we're working hard to counteract?
I think the number one is we've been beating ourselves up about slavery for a long time. Completely understandable. A nation that founds itself on all men are created equal, and yet felt they could not address slavery. And people say that was a mistake. That was typical of the American experience. It was a compromise. Our whole country is based on compromise. Our system of government, we're going through that right now. Can we get the Senate to do this? Will the House vote for this? What will the president do about that? There's all these compromises. What will the Supreme Court say? That's the way our system is, because we want everyone to be heard. But that whole idea of compromise is why they took out, Jefferson had written a whole section, railing against slavery in the Declaration and putting it at the feet of the king who had allowed the slave trade. And the irony, of course, besides the fact that Jefferson himself was a slave holder, and did not free his slaves upon his death, is that they knew that if they left that in there, that the southern colonies would not sign on, and they needed to have all 13 colonies on board, or else it would be not a war of revolution of independence, but a civil war, which we got later on anyway. But the idea was, look, we got to get independence first, and slavery will go away over time. We've got to focus on what's the
highest
main
priority.
thing. Yeah, the highest priority is getting independence.
Yeah.
And then what happened that nobody could have foreseen, and this is why history is so fascinating. It's always full of these, and then this happens, and no one saw that coming. And that is Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which suddenly made. See, at the time, slavery at the time of independence was mainly used in tobacco plantations, which for the most part where tobacco was beginning to fade into its importance. But no one saw in 20 years cotton was going to be king because of the cotton gin. And suddenly now you have an even greater need for slaves than you did before. So all the guys who thought slavery would be dying in the next 20 years, which they would have been right if the cotton gin hadn't invented, found that now you have this other thing which makes slavery even more powerful and made the South very, very wealthy. So those are the unforeseen things that happen. And that's why just saying slavery is bad and thus America was bad, at a time when there's still many places in the world where slavery is still existing today. We fought a war 600,000 Americans died in order to get rid of slavery. We need to have some credit for that. And then the other thing is that that most northern places don't talk about. I was at one point in time was married into a southern family, is Reconstruction. And the fact that Americans don't understand what happened with Reconstruction. They don't understand that the South still has a distrust of federal power because of what happened with Reconstruction. And people who might be listening to might say, what is he talking about? Good, go look it up. Because this is what the last part that we had this year with our kids, I said, this is really important. What happens in Reconstruction is more responsible for Jim Crow and racism and the need for the civil rights movement. It wasn't so much slavery, it was what happened with Reconstruction. And when you understand that, that is helpful to understand because it puts it all into context. And things now are in a situation where you say to yourself, okay, what is going on today that we might have our grandchildren learning in history class in 50 years saying, how could Americans let this happen in 2025? How could they let these kind of things go on? Which we, easily look back and judge people 70 years ago, 150 years ago, having to do with slavery or segregation, that sort of thing. So those are the things I think that really make it important for Americans to have a clear understanding of, and the fact that we're all humans and they're all going to make mistakes.
So it sounds like the idea of compromise, which, if we were going to be a nation that was not run by a monarchy or a dictator, obviously compromise has to be first and foremost at the thought, and that makes a lot of sense. And then the whole concept of Reconstruction, which honestly I never learned about Reconstruction. I didn't even.
You don't in the North. They do in the South.
Oh, interesting.
And that's another thing I used to talk to the kids about. I was working at a school that had kids from all over the country and all over the world. I looked at the kids who were in the northern areas. I said, do you know about Reconstruction? They all looked at me a blank look. I looked at the kids that were from Texas or southern states, and they go, oh, yeah, we had 4 or 5 weeks on Reconstruction. And that's because to them, this was really a big deal. It was one thing for them to lose their bid for independence, but what happened in Reconstruction made the South intensely distrust the federal government. And people don't understand that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, just you have to understand the way people think to understand that such a diverse regional country like ours, it's amazing that we're able to make it work. So many peoples and such a big land and so many different cultures involved, and yet we still have great pride for that flag that sits out front there.
Yeah. One of the other wonderful things we do in our school are field trips. And one of the things I absolutely love, particularly with history, is that we study the history and then we go and see it. And that was something we did in our homeschool. We ended up going to Trenton. We got to sit on the shores of the Delaware. We've done Rome. Personally, we've done just some wonderful things. However, when you jumped on board, it took us to a whole new level. We got to go to the World War I Museum in Kansas City. We went down south to a number of the battlefields. I'm trying to remember during our Martin Luther
we went
King.
to Fort Donaldson, which was where Grant became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. We went to see Andrew Jackson's home at the Hermitage, which is really important. We went to Memphis and went through the National Civil Rights Museum, which is actually, it's the former Lorraine Motel where Martin Luther King was assassinated.
That was amazing.
It into a national park, basically there. And my first big moment here at the school is when we went to Lincoln's home, and you guys went up to Lincoln's bedroom on the second floor, and the kids did the Gettysburg Address, and that I'm going. This is field trips aren't a chance to get out of the classroom. It's classroom in place. Yeah. And so when we did our recent, I'm wearing the shirt from the trip that we took out west to Gettysburg and Antietam and Harper's Ferry, and Washington D.C. If you have the kids prepped for that, and they understand that this is not getting out of class, this is classroom on site, they really can get into it. And those are the things that will stay with them all their lives. I'm so grateful we've done so many great trips together. I have to say, I think Getty's, though, took the cake. There was our day where we got to go around to all of the different sites there. We had a big bus. We had over 50 people, parents and kids. That's part of my secret agenda, is to loop the parents into this so that they can be more connected to their children, and we walk away more inspired, more grateful. But I recall when we were at one of the battle sites. I can't remember exactly where we were, but the kids were impelled. The guide was talking about the Gettysburg Address. He actually recited it, and little did he know that everyone sitting in front of him of student relations had that memorized, and so the kids stood up and did it. What was planned, though, was in that evening when we went to where Lincoln had said it in the National Cemetery, it had been like a 12-hour day. It was an incredibly long day, and I said to the kids, we had planned to say it right there, the Gettysburg Address, but I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to ask them to do it again. They've been so amazing. And then they wanted to do it. And it was very beautiful. We had taps played on the trumpet, and there were a lot of people around. The sun was setting, and it was one of those spiritual moments. Yeah. And I think the parents felt it. I felt it. It was very special. But connecting this whole Gettysburg experience, obviously you've taught this now 3 or 4 times with your kids. There was another moment you had, I think. Yes. I wish I had been there for that moment, but it was in the classroom. Yes, it was in the classroom. My wife was actually fortunate to be there today and witnessed that and said, wow, what a powerful thing. I was talking to the kids. We were doing our Civil War unit, and I was explaining to them why the Gettysburg Address is so important. I mean, it's very short, but he was not the speaker. They had another guy who was the speaker, and he was asked to give a few appropriate remarks. And his appropriate remarks was to try to give some sense of understanding to people. Lincoln's brilliant in that he's eloquent, and yet everyone can understand what he's saying from all levels of education. And he was trying to give some reason as to why this is going on. There's a lot of people who would have been very happy if he'd just let the South go rather than trying to preserve the Union. And so he was saying, this is why we have to finish this job. All the men who died at this battlefield didn't do it for no reason. The reason is so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, I started getting to the point where I was explaining to them about, people can't hallow this ground. They hallowed the ground. It's a new birth of freedom. And I started saying that, and a couple of the kids started picking it up as I was saying it. And a couple of kids added that. Before I knew it, the whole class was finishing the last 3 or 4 sentences of the Gettysburg Address. And when people say, why do you do rote memorization? That's why. You select important things that come down to the principles that you want kids to walk away from. And the Gettysburg Address, the reason that we went through that horrible experience, that's still the worst war we've ever been in. Worse than World War II.
50,000 deaths in 3 days.
And just 3 days there, and 600,000 in the whole war. At the time, that's like 2% of the population. Today, what that would be 60 million.
Oh my gosh, that's insane.
So it was a huge part of the I'm sorry, I take that back. It's not, but it's 6 million.
6 million,
that's
still
huge. And so it's to understand. He's trying to say this is why we've done this. We know there's more to go, but it's got to happen if we're going to preserve the idea that this can be done. We all assume that everyone figured it can be done. Self-government, that makes sense to us now. It's still, Europe was still waiting for us to unwind and fall apart. The British and the French were just waiting for the right moment to recognize the Confederacy's independence because they needed that cotton. And so Lincoln's saying, this is why we've got to finish this job. Otherwise, government of the people, by the people, for the people will end, because if the West suddenly California decides they want to leave, they can leave because it's been happened before. If Texas wants to leave, they can leave. So we got to make sure that union is permanent. And when people understand that 80 years after independence, it could have all unwound, and it's largely through the vision of people like Lincoln and the men who fought that war that didn't happen. And here we are 250 years later since independence, and we're been for some time the strongest nation on the planet, and our only one that's just got this massive number of people that are willing to risk their lives to come here. Who does that? What other country has that? There's a reason why. It's not just money, it's opportunity. And that's what we try to tell them about, who are Americans when you come to study American history. The unifying thing isn't your background. It's the ideals, it's the opportunity, it's the ambition. These are the people who are willing to risk all to come here, the risk takers that came here. And they want to be Americans, and we accept that.
I think the takeaway for me with what you're sharing today, the importance of what we're doing, history is the study of the best and the worst practices of humanity. And if we as classical educators can honestly highlight both of those, the kids can juxtapose that, make it their own, and with experiences like going to Gettysburg or having that moment in the class where maybe they memorize this recitation called the Gettysburg Address, and then all of a sudden they see it in context. I mean, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. It allows them to see the whole of the human pageant and their role in that.
Yes.
And that, to me, I think for me as the founder and as a mom and as a teacher, that's what I want them to make it their own. To your point, what is so special about America? It celebrates the human soul, and it doesn't denigrate it; it elevates it. And I feel like that's the torch you're passing. Is there anything else you want your kids to walk out of the classroom?
I guess the main thing when they walk out of their classroom, I want them committed to do their part to help tell this story, to help participate in this story. I want them to be voters. I want them to be educated voters. I've got one student that's been a staunch Democratic lawmaker out in Washington State, and I got another student that's been on, who I'm talking about, who's been on Fox News several times. And so they come out of my classroom not with a view politically, but with a view of the background and the pageantry and the background, the opportunity that people have coming to this country, and they've all got that too. And knowing how others have done that, and sometimes knowing the mistakes that we've made at different times, can make them better prepared to contribute towards that future vision of this country.
I think that sums it up well. Something I often say is that we're cultivating contributors, not consumers. And that's just what you said. And it's been a joy to have you be a partner in this important work.
Well, thank you, Katie. It's been one of the real highlights of my life.
Thank you for coming. So glad you all could join us for this very special episode of the Lady K podcast, and look forward to having you join us for our next episode.